Good morning. I'm Alice Newland, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Manatee County. On behalf of the League, I welcome you to our presentation today, the 2024 Post-Election Analysis. Today is Veterans Day, so let's take a moment and recognize with our sincere thanks and appreciation the veterans who have served our country and selflessly and courageously served. Our program today is being recorded and will be available on our website, and will also be included with a link on our monthly newsletter. It can be viewed and shared in its entirety, but you must get written permission if you intend to publish segments. At the end of the presentations, our speakers will be taking questions. Please put your questions in chat for Colleen Friedman and state which speaker the question is for, if it's for a specific speaker. So make sure it's Colleen that you put the question in for. Our speakers today are Dr. Frank Alcock and David Ballard. Dr. Alcock will discuss the winners, losers, and trends, and what this might mean for the state and locally. We will not be discussing national results in this meeting. David Ballard will review the 2024 election from the perspective of the Supervisor of Elections office. We will hear where things went smoothly and where they could use improvement. We will hear what they accomplished due to the hurricanes that were quite disruptive to the election process this year, and how the new clear ballot auditing system worked. So Dr. Frank Alcock is a professor of political science and environmental studies at New College of Florida. He holds a PhD in political science from Duke University and an MA in International Affairs from George Washington University, and a BA in Economics from Brigham University. Frank appears regularly as a political analyst on ABC News in Sarasota and was a candidate for state senate in 2016. David Ballard is an attorney and assistant Manatee County Supervisor of Elections, and was heavily involved in the operations of the 2024 election. So, Dr. Alcock, it's on to you. Is he here?
He was just a second ago on
He needs to unmute.
Okay.
He needs to unmute. Somebody needs to unmute him.
No, he has to unmute himself. No participant can unmute him. I see him there. I'm going to ask him.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear
Yes.
you. Yes.
I apologize. I'm having all sorts of problems. You ever start a meeting and then it says you need to update your Zoom, and so I did, and then it continued to crash every time I update it. I can't get the computer to work, so now I have to use the phone. But I'm here, so
Great. Thank you very much for joining us.
I know we're focusing on the state and local results. Just to set a little bit of context, I'm not going to spend too much time. But putting the state in the context of the national elections, just let me start there. The results will be, they are a decisive electoral college victory for Donald Trump. Coming into election night, on paper, it looked as if this was, the closest that we've seen and in anybody's memory with respect to polling, both in the national popular vote as well as with the swing states. Dead even in the national popular vote in polling, and then in the swing states, largely within 1 or 2 points in all 7. The actual outcomes are not that much of a shift from where the polling was. It was in the margin of error, but systematically underestimating for a third time straight the strength of the Trump vote by about 2 points, give or take. It looks as if Donald Trump will win the national popular vote by about 2 percentage points. And in the swing states, he'll win most of them, again, by about 2 to 3 points. He has swept all 7 of what were viewed as the swing states. But to underscore the closeness of the election, the blue wall, which was Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Trump is going to win Pennsylvania by a little over 2 points, Michigan by 1.5 points, and Wisconsin by 1 point, maybe slightly less than 1 point. Kamala Harris won the 2nd congressional district of Nebraska. And so without the 2-point swing, if she had held those 3 states, would have had an electoral college victory. And oddly enough, had that happened, it might have been an electoral college victory without a victory in the national popular vote. Breaking down, I think it's helpful to look at different demographic groups. Typically, the pictures in each of the states, including the state of Florida, are representative of what's happening demographically. Once in a while, something's happening in one state or a certain part of the country a little bit different than another state. But by and large, if you understand what's happening with the demographic groups, it'll kind of give you a good read, not only what's happening nationally, but in your particular states. Going into the election, Trump appeared to be having difficulties with a gender gap. There are more women that vote than men. It's not quite 50-50. And it looked as if he was losing the gap in terms of the preferences for Harris was greater than his advantage in the male popular vote. How pronounced that would be on election day was uncertain. And the flip side was the Harris and the Democrat traditional coalition, particularly with minority voters, was hemorrhaging support, particularly concerns within the Latino community, but also male voters, non-white male voters, voters of color, were migrating in Trump's direction. The results are in, and what you see, the picture that you see nationwide is Trump largely improved modestly in almost every cross-cutting demographic relative to his performance against Biden in 2020, with one exception. Interestingly enough, if you go back to the 2016 election and then 2020, Harris did slightly better with white voters than either Clinton or Biden, and did slightly better with 65 and over senior voters. Very slight. But that paled in comparison to the gains that Trump was able to make with minority group voters, particularly the Latino vote. And so just to give you some big picture numbers, and then I'll zero in on the state of Florida. On minority voters, with respect to Black men, according to exit polls, Clinton won them by 69 points. Biden won them by 60. Harris only won them by 56. So you see a downward trend there. With Black women, Clinton won them by 90. That's astonishing. 90 points. Biden by 81. Harris a slight uptick to 84. Latino men, Clinton won them by 31 points. Biden by 23 points. Harris lost them to Trump by 12 points. And that is a dramatic shift. It's not just Latino men, though. Clinton won Latina women by 44 points. Biden by 39 points. Harris only won them by 22 points. If we take these sort of racial outcomes and put them across age, education, and gender, there are still patterns with different age groups. Certainly, there's a gap between college-educated voters and non-educated voters, but these trends, particularly the trends within the Latino community, overpower the other trends. And I think that, as much as anything, the other would be the voters that identify themselves as moderate. That's another, I think, takeaway point. Clinton lost those voters, struggled with them. Biden did well. And the 2024 exit poll results look a lot more like the 2016 exit poll results with respect to moderate voters, not necessarily independent voters that are a bit of a different group, but with moderate voters. Let me zero in on Florida. I think these trends that you're seeing nationwide are even more pronounced in the state of Florida, with a shift towards Republicans in general, Trump at the top of the ticket in particular. But there's a second trend line that I think warrants some attention, and that's actually voter registration statewide. And if we go back actually to, I want to start in 2008, because that was the first year. That was when former President Obama was elected. They had a very, very strong voter registration operation, pushed the registration of Democratic voters in the state of Florida up to 4.8 million. There was a surge there, and Democrats had about a 700,000 voter advantage statewide. In 2012, they ramped up, hit about the same number of overall votes. Republicans were cutting into that a little bit. The Democratic advantage in the state was only 550,000. Obama did get reelected statewide in 2012. In 2016, the number of registered Democrats statewide was 4.9 million, inched up slightly, but the advantage for Democratic voters had dropped to 300,000 in the state of Florida. And we were seeing more voters at this time register unaffiliated or as NPAs. In the 2020 election, the number of Democratic voter registrations in the state of Florida reached 5.3 million, but the overall advantage over Republicans at that time was down to about 100,000. In 2024, the number of voter registration registered Democrats in the state dropped from 5.3 million to 4.4 million. And Democrats trail Republicans now by over 1 million registered voters. And that is just a dramatic shift in 4 years. I certainly would welcome hearing in terms of people that are there a speaker in terms of what we're seeing in Manatee County in terms of out migration or in migration. But within the span of 4 years to go from having 100,000 person advantage in voter registration to over 1 million behind is just a dramatic shift. It really changes the landscape for the entire state of Florida. If we shift also down statewide, the other thing to keep an eye on that just shows how dramatic the landscape has changed. Certainly Miami-Dade County, dramatic win for Trump. The overall results for the state, a 13-point victory for Trump, significantly better than he's done in the last 2 elections here. But I want to come back to the Latino vote within the state of Florida, because Florida, it's about a quarter of registered voters, or close to that, are of Latino descent. Unlike some other states, very mixed, with a significantly sized Cuban American community, as well as a Puerto Rican American community. and then significant, Mexican American and others. So it's not a monolithic group of voters, but very, very significant. If we shift the clock back to 2016, Clinton won the Latino vote within the state of Florida by a margin of 62 to 35. That's almost a 30-point victory. She lost the Cuban vote 41 to 54, but outside of the Cuban vote, her support, she actually won non-Cuban Latinos 71 to 36. Again, that is a 30 it's a dramatic victory for Clinton. Just in the span of 7 years, Harris lost overall Latino voters. She only got 40% of the vote from the Latino community. 58% went for Trump. So you're going from a almost 30-point advantage to almost a 20-point disadvantage. And then within the Cuban American community, she lost to Trump 72 to 28. And so with the Latino population being as important it is in the state of Florida, certainly down in the Miami-Dade County, but also in the I-4 corridor, that type of shift, realignment, it's a realignment, gives you, I think, what you see statewide, combined again with the overall voter registration shifting in towards Republicans. With respect to the results in Manatee County or Sarasota County, it's a little bit more conservative than the rest of the state. So the margin of victory statewide races here in these counties was maybe about 5-10 point, higher than it was overall statewide. With respect to Manatee County Commission, it will be all Republicans that will be on the county commission. It was largely a sweep. Statewide on the constitutional amendments, we can come back and talk about those. Very close, but the other than a tax amendment, all amendments failed, including the two through citizens petition initiatives, which were amendments 3 and 4, legalization of marijuana, as well as reproductive rights. Reproductive rights came a little closer to the 60% threshold than marijuana legalization, lost by only about 2.5 points. Here in the Manatee County, that margin was 55% voted in favor of that, as opposed to close to 57, 58 statewide. And so a little bit more resistance here, but this county locally was close to that. Going forward on those two amendments, given their success of similar amendments around the country, I don't think that these issues will go away. And so I would expect the supporters of amendments 3 and 4 to come right back at it in the next election cycle. I think I'm probably hitting close to my time mark here.
I think we can give you at least 5 more minutes. So just keep going with your observations. We're missing Mitch. He had a family emergency, so that angle on the local is you got time.
Okay. And I'm not going to eat so much of the time. I can come back to local and take some specific questions. The emphasis or my focus on Manatee County particulars, probably not as extensive as Sarasota County, and the tension generally is a bit diminished. There was nothing, and I can come back and again look a bit more closely real time here with some results, but there was nothing that really stood out to me with respect to Manatee or Sarasota County. Margins on statewide elections for Republican candidates, margins of victory were strong. I think one of the things that did stand out was very high turnout rates we had in Manatee and Sarasota County. Again, the other speaker can speak to that. There's also some shifting particularly among Republican voters, to early voting. Democrats more evenly distributed across the three modalities of voting, and then overall still more of an emphasis on mail-in voting, whereas Republicans really big dramatic shift away from election day voting to early voting, less so on mail-in voting, as well as the voting on election day. But across the board, and all state representative, state senator, county commission, school board votes were a little closer, but decisive win for Republican candidates that largely matched the registration and advantage, and more and a stronger turnout, I think, on the Republican side within our local county. Turnout among Democrats, I think, commendable, but super strong among Republicans. And then, as I had said, I don't have specific data on what accounts for that, those lower overall statewide registration numbers. But that shift, the one thing that, if there's one of the big takeaways from my input to this follow-up is the advantage Republicans have been gaining statewide in terms of the registration, sort of neutralizing right around 2020 a Democratic voter registration advantage statewide. But you see everything creeping up, and then suddenly between 2020 and 2024, it's close to almost a drop of 900,000 registered Democrats within the state of Florida. That's rather dramatic. We don't see that drop in unaffiliated or in certainly not with the Republican voters. But the shift to over 1 million voter registration advantage for Republicans is continued small gains, but a dramatic drop among the registered Democrats within the state of Florida just in the last 4 years.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to make a little observation myself that Mitch might have made for the local, and that is that that money didn't count on the Board of County Commissioners meeting.
Okay.
So what we saw was, and the primary became the big battle. So we saw a record amount of money spent to bring back Kevin Van Ostenbridge. That did not work. Huge dollars. We also saw that, and on the candidates that were backed, there was a lot of money put into James Satcher. So that what we saw in our county was, yes, it's Republican, but it was not every single one of the developer-backed candidates that were Republican did not win. It was Republicans that were not the developer ones, the Supervisor of Elections, the Board of County Commissions. And part of that shift that you're seeing, definitely within Manatee County, there was a lot of fear about our election process. So there was some shifting on that. The other thing that of note on the amendments is that that actually the majority of people did vote for putting the candidate's party on Amendment 1, but they didn't get 60%. And again, in Manatee County, we had school board races where we had 3 in the primary, which nobody got greater than 50%, so there becomes a runoff. And in that runoff, it was not the higher funded candidates that won. Now, one of the races, I think in Heather and Mark Stanich, I'm not sure either of them had much money, but definitely there was more poured into the other candidates. So that that's a trend that there was just a belief that money made the candidate. And so we're really looking beyond R&D in Manatee County, that we actually had where the enormous amount of money that was poured into the campaign could not bring, it could not have an unpopular candidate win. So, and I'm going to now move on to David to tell us all about the Supervisor of Elections office and dealing with an extremely difficult election with all these storms we had. David?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to introduce myself first. My name is David Ballard. I'm the Chief of Staff for the Manatee County Supervisor of Elections. Prior to this, I have a public policy background. I worked in both chambers of the Florida Legislature, including for the chairman of the Ethics and Elections Committee, the Judiciary. I think a professional highlight for me is that I worked in 2018 on the Florida Constitution Revision Commission. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a legislative body appointed by the governor and the presiding officers of each chamber. And I worked on the 13 amendments that were placed onto the ballot that year, including one that started as an idea on a yellow legal pad in my office, and that was Amendment 13, which banned dog racing. So that is a professional highlight for me, and it's something I'm really happy about. That same year, we also had a recount, and I worked on that too here in Sarasota County. So Frank already said pretty much everything that I would highlight. He had asked the question, I don't know what the registration numbers look like. Well, really, over the last 2 years, Manatee County has only seen an increase of 2,000 voters. However, the way those voters are distributed among the two major parties and NPAs is quite different. We've had 1,000 less NPAs over that time period, 11,000 more Republicans, and 7,000 fewer members of the Democratic Party over that time. For this election, we saw historic turnout. We were at 82%. Heading into the election, I put the over-under at 81.5. So that's the number that I was planning on for the last 6 months. And we were a little bit over. As mentioned, there was a change in the way that the public, is specifically in Manatee County, but I think it's statewide, chose to vote. We saw enormous numbers of early voters, as opposed to in the past, there was a trend toward vote by mail. And I think that there are several very big reasons for that. I think a smaller reason is also the two storms that hit our area. If you look at the western portion of our county, the Barrier Islands of West Bradenton, they do have a higher utilization rate of vote by mail, and that did impact, but our turnout numbers in that area were still similar to the rest of the county. Now, even though the numbers for registration haven't changed that much, there was an enthusiasm gap, it appears, from different parties. For example, 85.6% of registered Republicans voted, 73.5% of NPAs, and 80.9% of members of the Democratic Party voted. So even though they made up a larger portion of the voting population as a whole, then those numbers would suggest both the Democratic Party and NPAs, they were voting at a lower rate than you would expect by their actual registration numbers. So it's there's a really interesting time in elections. There's a lot that's data driven, it's data based. So you can really fine tune exactly what we're looking at. So for example, our early voting, we saw double compared to 2022 gubernatorial election, where this year it made up 44% of all the votes that we saw. Election day has stayed around 25% since vote by mail has become more popular and available. However, there's been a huge swing between those two. So of all those that voted, 48% were Republican, 25.2% 26.2% were Democrats and 26.8% were NPA. So there's been a small shift in registrations, but it's more been between parties that we've seen a greater change of, and there's an enthusiasm gap. As it pertains to storm, every part of our county was impacted by the storm, by both storms. During Helene, we really saw the devastation that hit Palmetto Point, the Barrier Islands, parts of Bayshore Gardens, parts of Bradenton, the Braden Castle area. There was many of our coastal areas were impacted. And then when the second storm came through, it was more of a wind event, and it really hit some of those same areas, but specifically Bayshore Gardens, Palmetto, and moving north toward the Piney Point area. So directly after, we were out assessing locations, albeit with a gas shortage and closed down roads. But so we were checking in on these places, and a lot of places, they were more than happy to see us. And we tried to connect them with the help that was available through the county and through FEMA, if so needed. And the vast majority of our polling locations were able to get back online in a timely fashion. However, that wasn't the case for all of them. So we did relocate or co-locate 5 polling locations, with 3 of those being on the Barrier Islands and then 2 toward the Bayshore Gardens area. And so we were able to co-locate those, get that information out. We mailed every voter. We also really appreciate the partnership of local media to get that messaging out there so that people can know how they can vote. One thing with early voting is that it has changed it's changed the game entirely. It makes it an opportunity for people still to have that in-person experience while avoiding the hecticness that is election day. For my staff, it's not as all or nothing, which we appreciate, but it's more like a marathon than a sprint. I mean, we have 2 weeks where I have people here for 14, 16, 18 hours a day. And so I personally, I've been on the clock since the first storm. So it's really impressive. Thank a poll worker, thank an elections worker. We had over 500 poll workers, some of whom lost their homes, and they were still willing to commit to us and to the people of Manatee County. So I do appreciate them greatly. Another issue with the storm is always, as with everything elections, it's information and disinformation. We had groups telling people that their votes would not count if they didn't put proper postage on it. Well, that's not true. There's no delay. We work hand in hand with the Postmaster General, with our federal partners, to make sure that all elections mail, regardless of if it has postage on it, is returned to us just the same as if it does. And then we settle up with USPS post-election. So moving forward, please, I would still ask that you do properly postage your vote by mail ballot. But if you do forget, it will still make it to us, and it is counted just the same as if you had. Again, we had other people saying that early voting, the different times, different locations, days, just general misinformation. And then at the polls, the same thing. I can't tell you how many calls I received from voters saying there's people out there in a tent saying that if you're not registered to this party, then you can't drop off your ballot here, or you can't vote here. And it's simply not correct. We have a commitment to fair, accurate elections. And overall, this was a pretty big one. It was a 2-card ballot, so it made for a long time period on election day specifically to get people in and have a great voting experience and then out in an efficient manner. There's 3 areas where you can really run into choke points. It's either at check-in, and then a location to actually fill out your ballot, and then at the tabulator, the DS200, in which you're feeding afterward. So just depending on location, if there is a slowdown, it's usually one of those 3 areas. As it pertains, someone did mention Amendment 1, and I wanted to touch on that because I worked for the CRC. So in that time period, I had an opportunity to really study the history of the CRC. It only meets once every 20 years. And so it's a very small group of people who have had the opportunity to be on that. Well, we got to the position that we are currently where all school board races are NPA. That's not how it was before 1998. In 1998, because of the CRC amendment that was passed, the school board, it changed to non-party affiliation. And anyone who knows anything about Florida politics knows something else happened right around that same time with the advent of Daniel Webster and the switching of first the Florida Senate and then the Florida House and the governorship, where it was one party control for a very long time, and then it became dual controlled, and now it's kind of stuck with one party ever since then. That's not entirely true. I do not want to discredit Ms. Freed and her efforts as Commissioner of Agriculture, or Ms. Sink as CFO when she won election in 2006. Not to take anything away from them, but for both chambers of the legislature, that has been how it goes. So it was a big election, a 2-page ballot. We saw 460,000 pieces of paper come into this office, each of which is maintained with the utmost scrutiny. And so it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I was happy to be involved. And I really thank the rest of the team here with the Supervisor of Elections. I can't say enough great things. These people care. They have servants' hearts. They care about our republic and democracy. So thank you.
Thank you. And Colleen, do we have questions?
We do have a few, and I'll start with Mr. Ballard since he went last. The question is for David: why doesn't Manatee have voting on the Sunday, the last Sunday before the election? Sarasota does. There were apparently very long lines. One day might have made a difference. Can you just give us a little understanding of that?
Absolutely. So Sarasota does on that Sunday. The other thing is, though, Sarasota has over triple the budget of Manatee County Supervisor of Elections. So it's an opportunity for my staff to prep up for a huge election day. The other thing we've seen during early voting is that Sunday is always the lightest day. We had 8 days of early voting during the primary, and we saw that last Sunday, it didn't take up a huge chunk of any other day. I think what did make a difference, though, is that we had opened an 8th early voting location in the primary, and what it helped us do here during the general election is it actually took Rocky Bluff from being our largest early voting site during a general election and made it the 3rd or 4th every day. So we were looking at it from a holistic approach and where there is the most value. So by opening up that, it created a more positive voting opportunity at several locations. And the same thing with Braden River Library, with Lakewood Ranch Library and Town Hall. Those are now our 1 and 2. And so having other locations east of 75 or Braden River, which is it's to some, to our friends who have been here for generations, that's still out east, but it is relatively west compared to where the centrality of our population is. So that it's an opportunity for us to get our ducks in a row for election day. And there is a cost benefit analysis there, obviously, but we are a little bit more concerned with that 25% turnout rather than that 0.5 percentage point that we would have anticipated on that day.
Well, thank you. The next question is for Frank. If you look at the issues that our voters voted for environmental protections, and even the abortion amendment got 57%, which are traditionally Democratic values. What do you attribute the disconnect between their position on issues and the candidates they vote for that do not share those values?
Thank you. Yeah, for that question. It's a good question. Certainly, there does appear disconnect sometimes between the values that broad numbers of Americans profess and then what they end up voting for, at least top of the ticket. What I do think is come back to a really important common thread. It's the rise of very strong populist sentiments that we've seen now for the better part of a decade that don't seem to be subsiding. When I use the term populism, it's a political science term, but it's just a broad sense that the elites or the powerful groups or the establishment within our society sort of are serving their own interests, and they're not paying attention or doing right by the common citizen. Donald Trump certainly has captured, among other groups, sort of right-wing populist sentiments, and he's certainly not viewed as being part of the system or part of the establishment. Democrats have struggled a bit with that. Hillary Clinton was often viewed as the embodiment of the establishment. So even on the left-wing side, you do have a number of people that were very, very supportive of Bernie Sanders, who I would describe or characterize very strong left-wing populists, that moved over to Trump, from Sanders over to Trump. Biden, and to some extent, I think Kamala Harris are not necessarily a sharp break from what is viewed as the system or the establishment. I think that is a really, really big driver. And then certainly there are lots of other groups and people, how they package, again, their preferences and the votes that they take can get a bit more complex. But I will come back. Let me just make one more point, and it's just follow up to Alice's point on just the role of money and what Manatee County saw, more so than Sarasota County, in the primary on county commissioners. So there is a palpable, people are not happy with what they view as to be overdevelopment, and a lot of what's happening. We're experiencing rapid development in this area, both Sarasota and Manatee counties. People are upset about that, and so support for candidates at the county commission level that'll put the brakes to some extent, again, not being anti-growth, but more of a smart growth, has garnered some support. And the idea that certain candidates will be just supported by big developers with profuse amounts of money, that is actually, there's some resistance there. It fits the overall voting patterns. Money is still important, but it's not a one-to-one match. In Sarasota County, within Republican primaries, one in particular for one of the seats on the county commission, the sort of the more moderate, sustainable growth Republican candidate ultimately lost. That didn't happen here in Manatee County. And so I think the point that, big dollars in local elections it doesn't automatically lead to victory. I think it is an important point. It's part of the sign of the times that we're living. Not that money doesn't matter, but I think broader sentiments across the country, and they certainly hold true here, are, again, tired of what they see as a broken system. They place blame in different places at the top of the ticket. Certainly what we saw, on reproductive rights, more than half of the voters in Sarasota County, in the Manatee County, voted for that. A little bit less than what happened statewide, but that was, not part of the Republican Party platform. There's still broad support for that. So I do think on certain values, whether it be the environment, whether it be reproductive rights, people are what they are. We're not seeing, again, values change drastically around the country, but there is a very palpable populist, anti-establishment, anti-system sentiment, and that hasn't subsided at all. It reared its head once again in this election, and Donald Trump was the beneficiary of that sentiment, not Kamala Harris.
Just a quick, while we have you, and then we'll jump to David, a question for David. Regarding the amendments, is there any appetite, do you think, for the legislature to change it to 50%, to go back to the 50% threshold on the amendments?
David, you want to answer first, and then I can chime in?
I can. No, there won't be the appetite for that. They only changed that, I think it was in 2020 that they bumped it up to 60%. So it's a fairly new development, and the legislature has a strong distaste for citizens initiatives, for the CRC. It does reduce the how do I say this? Their ability to control what gets on the ballot.
Yeah, I think I come out in the same place. David, I think it was actually 2006 or 2008. I remember there was again anger, pregnant pig administrative. And so you could put like support for ham sandwiches on the ballot, and a lot of that stuff's just going to run in the low 50s. And so by moving, to a supermajority requirement for changing our constitution, there are other states that do that. It certainly varies state to state. But I don't. Our legislature does not want to go down to I think 50%. And as David pointed out, we have more vehicles for changing our state constitution in the state of Florida than any other state, including a citizens initiative petition process. Our legislature can easily put things on the ballot, and if there's something that's coming through the citizens initiative process, it means that the legislature doesn't want it. Otherwise, they would have put it on the ballot themselves. And so, I do think much of what we've seen in Florida politics over the last couple of decades is attempts to wrestle or raise the bar, whether it be through petition requirements or the number of petition requirements or hurdles, or sort of as a final, a final hurdle, a supermajority of 60%. So I would agree. I don't think you're going to see the legislature revisit this. And I don't actually think it's necessarily a bad thing. If it's down at 50%, we could see many, many things, and things actually, the way that they're crafted, like the rail amendment, it'll be on one year, it'll be flipped the next year. And so just for constitutional stability, the 60% threshold, I know it really bothers them for some people when you come in a little bit short of that, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Thank you.
And if I can touch base, yes, Frank, 2006, 2020 was when they changed how many signatures and petitions needed for that process.
Right.
But yeah, as Frank said, look at a state like Alabama. So Alabama has a very interesting view of what their constitution is. It's the longest. And so as he mentioned, they don't seem to want to go toward that. They look at it more as of a power granting document as opposed to the federal constitution, so just the philosophy on it, I think in Florida might be different, but yes, we echo the same sentiments.
Oh, I'm starting to get a lot of questions for David, so I'm going to start with the first one. Can you just tell us briefly how the clear ballot system worked?
Certainly. So we're actually in a manual hand count right now, and that actually fulfills the audit obligation. And so it ultimately, for our statutory obligations, that's being taken care of through the machine recount and then a hand recount. So Lakewood Ranch CDD 5, seat 2, we have a tie right down to the wire. So because of that, there's a statutory requirement that we go through the recount process. So ultimately, to satisfy that statutory obligation, will be done by that. We are, although, working with the Leroy Collins Institute at Florida State University to really take a big look at the data that produces. So that's moving forward. So from the sake of its audit function, it has done everything we needed it to, but ultimately what we needed was to just get out the ballots and look at them one by one the old-fashioned way.
So another question, let me just see. How many vote by mail ballots were rejected, and what were the main problems with those ballots?
Well, so there are some, when you say rejected, there's a couple things that can mean. And I think what the question really has to do with is how many signatures are rejected. So out of the 70,000 or so that we received, I don't have a direct number in front of me, but it's less than 250 that are rejected by the canvassing board. But there's an additional number that are automatically rejected. So if someone already mailed in a ballot, then their second ballot's rejected. If they failed to sign their ballot, that is rejected. Also, mind you, every signature reject or incomplete signature, those folks have an opportunity to cure that signature with an affidavit up to 2 days after. So what we had the canvassing board do is go ahead and look at these signatures ahead of time, but a lot of those are reinstituted even before and after that initial rejection. And so a lot of times, think about someone, they don't have an updated signature on file. They're suffering from a medical issue. And so their signature just isn't going to look the same. And so they still have the opportunity to cast a meaningful vote because of that affidavit.
And then another question, how many registered Democrats were removed from the rolls, and how many registered Republicans were removed statewide and in Manatee County? That's the question as it was sent in. So you can.
So how many were removed?
So I think, from the rolls. Yeah.
I think this question comes from a slight, so the removal process, it's inactivity is ultimately what creates that. There's also other things like moving out of county will also remove you from Manatee County's rolls. Moving out of state will also do that. So there's several ways that one can come off the rolls in Manatee County. So if that's the question, as it's party specific, so the net it is minus 7,000 members of the Democratic Party since 2022. Again, that also includes people that are switching parties. So there's a lot of things that go into that, but as it pertains to the actual maintenance of the rolls, it's not automated, but it's given the exact same function and it's based on time period. So there is nothing that from our end that suggests one party or the other that there's a registered voter atrophy at a higher rate, one or the other, or for NPAs. I would actually assume that with NPAs, it is at a slightly higher rate. They just have a lower enthusiasm. There's a big enthusiasm gap a lot of times. As I mentioned, I think they voted at 73% of registered NPAs voted, where it was close to 81 and 85 for members of the two major parties.
Interesting. Okay, so this is a question for either one or both of you. One party rule creates a lot of, I guess this is rhinos and dinos. A lot of Democrats and MPAs here want to take part in Republican primaries. Any guess how many rhinos in Manatee or Sarasota?
That question likely would be best answered by my office. So I'm not going to speak. There's a certain connotation that goes with those terms that I don't want to address. That's not my role. I'm just a bureaucrat. So, but as it pertains to people who switch parties, there's a natural built-in amount of people as they get older or have life experiences. Sometimes their party affiliation and preference just changes. So no matter what, there is always a baseline of party flips. I think post primary, I think we likely saw an excess of maybe 1,500 or maybe 2,000 of what one would typically expect during that time period. But it was also a historically low turnout for the primary. So it's impossible to gauge exactly the reason that someone is deciding to switch their party or deciding to vote or not vote. So from our standpoint, we're going to process each and every one. That's just our role. We're not a player on the field. I wouldn't even call us the umpire. I would call us the groundskeepers because we're just setting the field and making sure the players have appropriate safety and safeguards in place.
And one more question that just caught my eye. How many provisional ballots were needed?
There were approximately 600 provisional ballots that were cast. And the reasons for those, it varied. Some, I would say the majority fell into one of three categories. they registered after the deadline to register for this election, which was October 7th. So that's when books closing is. That's when we're statutorily required to report to the Department of State and the Division of Elections what our books look like for that election. And it gives the state an opportunity to prepare things on their end. You have to have a moment in time to freeze that, and that's the date that they've chosen. The other are just people that aren't registered, and then they don't register afterward either, which I find interesting. A presidential general election is the greatest voter registration drive that exists. The number of new registrations we have. So all those people that were too late to vote in this election, the thought is that they become active voters moving forward for years to come. And then the third biggest category for issuing provisionals, someone just forgot their ID. They just didn't, that's it. So for the vast majority of those, we give them a provisional. Those provisionals are then viewed by the canvassing board and the staff here at the Supervisor of Elections. They do research on every single one of these that comes in 2 days. So that means those 600 people, we went and pulled all their voter information. We confirmed their address, what precinct they're in over that time period, and then presented that to the canvassing board. So there's even situations where someone may register, but then they didn't confirm their address. And so they're kind of in limbo, or they didn't confirm their license number. Well, if they show up and cast a provisional and have that information on there, we consider that acknowledging our letter and actually confirming their information. So their provisional vote is also tallied.
Thank you, Alice. I think I know there might be one or two more questions, but it looks like we're sort of getting to the hour. So you tell me.
We are, and so and there's a lot of interest, and I'm sure there's a lot more questions there. So if after I do my close, anybody wants to stay on, they can. And but we are at the end of the hour, and thank you both. You've given us a lot of information and a lot of detailed local information that I'm sure there's a lot of interest in, and you've been both very, very helpful in understanding the election. So I'm going to ask everyone to please visit our website, LWV, like League of Women Voters, manatee.org. Within the next 2 weeks, we have 4 action team meetings, and 1 week after that, we have another. So this week, we've got tonight a combined government, national popular vote, and guns meeting. And anybody that gets tired of they're pursuing one county in Nebraska for votes more than they do the state of Florida, might want to be on tonight and learn about national, or talk about more promotion of national popular vote. Thursday, we have a reproductive rights meeting, which is in person rather than Zoom. The next week, on Tuesday, there's an education meeting, which is actually participating in the school board meeting. And then Thursday, there's a Zoom meeting for natural resources. Following week after that, there's voter services. And if you are not a member, please join the League of Women Voters, because right now, your annual membership will be good until the end of 2025. And you'll be able to attend our new member meet and greet on December 4th. That's actually been delayed twice because of storms. So we're finally going to have a meet and greet. And if you wait till after January, the cost of membership is actually going to go up. And you'll have to wait a whole nother year for a meet and greet. So thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.